Well, good morning again, everyone. It is such a delight to see all of you. My name is Bryan Fojtasek. I am the student pastor here at Westside, and I absolutely love this church and love my job. And I just want to extend a special welcome to all of our guests this morning. I have visited churches for the first time, and it can be a very overwhelming feeling, especially if you're a little bit more on the shy side. So if you're visiting for the first time today, or maybe the second or third, we just want to say thank you and welcome. And we hope that today is a true joy in your life and a blessing to you and to your family. But I would just love to tell you about the time when I ruined my family's deviled eggs. Is there anyone in the room that really is like adamantly opposed to deviled eggs? Is anyone like super excited about deviled eggs? Okay, good. Well, that's good to know. Well, you probably wouldn't have liked this batch because back several years ago, when we were living in Lakeside, California, I decided to whip up some deviled eggs. And I do most of the cooking in my house, and I kind of enjoy it, and I like to think that I do a decent job. But this time, I completely blew it. So what happened was, I printed out a recipe for deviled eggs from the internet, and by the way, there's really not a lot that goes into it, but I still felt the need to print out a recipe for deviled eggs from the internet, and it was just Tracy and me, so we didn't need the full batch. So I said, that's simple. I'll just cut the recipe in half. It's so easy. So I cooked half of the eggs, and I started measuring everything out. And I got to the mustard. Now in deviled eggs, you need a little bit of mustard. It really kind of brightens the flavor profile of the deviled eggs, makes it pop just a little bit. And so the mustard gives it a nice little acidity that, just kind of rounds out the flavor. And that's so wonderful, isn't it? Well, here's the deal. I cut the recipe in half, but I forgot to cut the mustard in half. And so my deviled eggs had 2 times the amount of mustard. But we are not done, folks. We are not done with the ways that I messed up the deviled eggs. You see, the recipe called for something like 1 teaspoon of mustard. And I should have done the half, but I did the full. But when I looked down, what I was holding was not a teaspoon. What I was holding was a tablespoon. So let's count this up, folks. Not only did I do twice the amount as I should have, I was holding a tablespoon instead of a teaspoon, which is 3 times as much. So now I'm up to 6 times the mustard in the deviled eggs. I don't know if you've ever had a spoonful of mustard, but that's essentially what we had. Egg-flavored mustard, and it was not very good. So it's kind of interesting how just a little bit of something can be great, but when you really overdo it, it turns into a big problem. And that's true even for some of the most wonderful and beautiful things of the world, like In-N-Out cheeseburgers, all right? So one of my favorite things to do is to go to In-N-Out, and I don't know what your order is, but mine is a double-double with grilled onions, fries if I'm feeling it, a Dr. Pepper if I'm feeling it. But I really like In-N-Out. I think personally that's the best fast food hamburger out there. We can debate it later, but that's my opinion, all right? Well, if you look at the menu, there's really only 3 things on there in terms of burgers. You got your hamburger, you got your cheeseburger, and you got your double-double. But if you've been to In-N-Out, and if you've been around California for a while, you know there's a secret menu that goes into this. And you can order far more than what they tell you. So if you're really hungry, you can get a triple or a 4x4, where they start doing like 3 burger patties or 4 burger patties. Well, let's just take this to the ultimate extreme, because there was a group of 8 friends in Las Vegas, and they really wanted to do something special. So they didn't just order a double-double or a triple or a 4x4 or a 5x5 or a 10x10. They ordered a 100x100. 100 beef patties, 100 pieces of cheese in between 2 hamburger buns. And so this monstrosity of a burger, and by the way, if you're wondering if this is Weight Watchers friendly, the answer is absolutely not, because this monstrosity of a burger has 19,500 calories. It only costs $98, which is sort of a bargain if you split that 8 ways. It took 8 people, a group of 8 people, 2 hours to complete, and somehow only one of them got sick. If a double-double is good, if a little bit is good, then a lot must be better, right? Isn't that kind of the culture that we live in? I don't know about you, but when if I go to McDonald's or the movie theater or something like that, and I order a medium soda, and they're like, oh, do you want to change that to a large? It's only 25 cents more. I'm like, absolutely, I do. You know that I do. Why are you even asking me this question? Because if some is good, then a lot has to be better. That's kind of the mentality sometimes. So my question for you is, if you signed up for the 100 by 100 burger challenge, who's on your team of 8? Who's going to help you out with that? My top draft picks, Kel Harris, Noel Villarreal Jr., because those guys know how to take care of business at the dinner table. But who would be on your team of 8? Who's going to help you with the 100 by 100 burger challenge? All right, well, stop and think about this for a moment. What is your favorite food that you just cannot get enough of? Is it lasagna or steak or cheesecake or pizza or sushi or fish tacos? What is it? What's your favorite food? Go ahead and tell your neighbor right now, what's your favorite food that you could not get enough of? If you ate it over and over again, you would still like it. 1, 2, 3, go. What is that? Fried chicken. Good answer. That's a good answer. All right, so everyone has their favorite food in your mind. Your favorite food in your mind, all right? If you had to eat your favorite food over and over and over again, meal after meal after meal, day after day after day, how long do you think you could go before you couldn't stand that food anymore? How long would it take before you're like, you know what? I actually think I'm good. Or what if you had one huge, ginormous table just full of your favorite meal? And we're talking like 3 or 4 or 5 portion sizes just for you, and you had to eat it all at once. How long would it take before that started to feel less like a blessing and more like a curse? Sometimes things can be good in small amounts, but we kind of all recognize, like the mustard and the deviled eggs or the beef patties on the 100 by 100, sometimes less is more. Our sermon series for the month of September is called Losing It, and it's based off of the passage in Luke chapter 9, verse 24, where Jesus says, if you really fight with everything you have to cling to your life, to cling to the life of this world, you're going to lose it. But if you willingly give up your life for Jesus, and then you save it. And it's one of these seemingly contradictory, paradoxical statements that Jesus likes to use in order to really get us to start thinking. And the idea here is that there are things of this world that we can sometimes cling to because we think they're going to make us happy or give us purpose or help us find meaning. And sometimes we need to let go of the things we think we need, because it's those very same things that can lead us farther away from God and drain us emotionally and physically and spiritually. And so in honor of the kind of paradoxical statements that Jesus likes to use, we're calling today's message, Less is More. And we're going to look at a passage in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus talks about fasting, the spiritual discipline of saying no to certain things for a specific amount of time, so that we can learn to be more present with God and more available to his call in our lives. So if you have a Bible or your Bible app, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 16. We've been exploring different parts of the Sermon on the Mount for the past several weeks, and this is sort of right smack in the middle of everything. It says in Matthew 6, verse 16, "And when you fast, don't make it obvious as the hypocrites do, for they like to look miserable and disheveled, so people will admire them for their fasting. I tell you the truth, that is the only reward they will ever get. But when you fast, comb your hair and wash your face. Then no one will notice that you are fasting, except your Father who knows what you do in private. And your Father who sees everything will reward you." So think for a moment about what you heard Jesus saying to you in that passage. What is it that you think Jesus wanted you to hear or to know or to believe after hearing that? One thing that really stood out to me as I was reading and studying this passage this week is that Jesus doesn't actually spend a whole lot of time talking about fasting in his teaching about fasting. At least he doesn't talk about the mechanics of it, of what is the dictionary definition of it, or how often should we do it, or what should we give up, or what are the rules surrounding it, or how long is it supposed to last. He spends a lot more talking about your heart and your motivation going into it, and making sure that when you do it, you're keeping the focus on God instead of drawing attention to yourself. And if you take a step back in this passage and look at what else he's been talking about in Matthew chapter 6, it fits in perfectly with the overall theme of what he's teaching on. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus is actually talking about 3 different spiritual disciplines: giving, praying, and fasting. And when you look at what Jesus says about each one of these, there's sort of the central theme that emerges. The idea here is that we need to put the focus back on God and stop using them to draw attention to ourselves. Jesus, when he talks about each one of these spiritual disciplines, he's using the exact same phrasing and grammatical structure to talk about each one. It's sort of a pattern that he's using. He starts out by saying, when you give, or when you pray, or when you fast, don't be like these hypocrites who do it for all of the wrong reasons. And he kind of gives you the big picture. Don't be like them. And then after that, he goes into some of the more specifics about, well, what should you do while you're doing these things? So while you're giving, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. While you're praying, go into your room and pray privately so that no one can see and hear what you're doing. While you're fasting, take care of yourselves. Don't intentionally make yourselves look sick or weak or weary, but do it in a way that doesn't draw attention to yourself. Don't flaunt it for the whole world to see. And by the way, did you notice that he's using the word when instead of the word if? Isn't there a really big difference between the word if and when? So if I leave for work in the morning and Tracy says, I love you, give me a call when you make it to work. Isn't that so nice and wonderful and cute and romantic? But if she says, I love you, give me a call if you make it to work. Well, then suddenly it's like, whoa, what do you know that I don't? Suddenly me making it there safely is, what did you do to my brakes, right? So if and when are 2 very different statements. And Jesus isn't saying if you decide to pray, or if you decide to give, or if you decide to fast. He says when. And the fact that he's talking about this as something that's sort of a given should probably tell us he really values giving and praying and fasting. And when you look at the original language here, he's using a specific word and a specific word tense that means a regularly repeated action. Not a one-off or a once-in-a-blue-moon thing, but the language he's using is talking about something that gets repeated on a consistent basis over and over again. He's talking about prayer and giving and fasting as if it's something that's just a natural part of our daily rhythm. So he's talking about things here that really should be a consistent part of our life. So as we read and study this passage in Matthew chapter 6, it becomes pretty clear that Jesus really wants us to worship God, but he doesn't want us to worship God like all of these hypocrites were doing. And in fact, every time he talks about one of these spiritual disciplines, he says, I want you to do this, but don't do it like the hypocrites. Don't be like the hypocrites. He says that 3 times. See, their issue is that they love to worship God, but they use their worship as an opportunity to draw attention to themselves. They had really impure motives about why they were giving or why they were praying or why they were fasting. And they were using their worship experience, their love for God, as a way to prove to other people that they were religiously superior, that they should be admired, they should be looked up to. And so Jesus really takes issue with their heart. In the passage about giving, Jesus says these hypocrites were looking to be noticed. And I put the Greek words there if you wanted to write those down and look those up a little bit later for more study. But he's talking about how they want to be noticed. They're looking for people to, they're trying to impress people. They're trying to attract attention to themselves. He said they were searching for ways to be praised and honored, to have their own reputation enhanced by giving to other people. And it's kind of like when a corporation wants to make a donation to a nonprofit or a charity or a scholarship fund, and they send someone out with one of those comically oversized checks, right? And it's like this big, and they do this huge photo op so that everyone can know how generous this corporation is. And you can't actually do anything with that big check. It's just for show. But they want to make sure that everyone knows what they're doing and how they're giving, and they post it on their social media accounts, #GiveBack, #philanthropy, and all this stuff so that everyone can see how wonderful and generous they are. And Jesus says, look, if you're going to give, don't flaunt it for the whole world to see. And in the passage about prayer, Jesus says the hypocrites are looking to be recognized, to be known by their outward appearance rather than their inner character. And so they might have been directing their prayers to God, but they were intended for other people to hear. Using fancy words, really religious words, really, just drawing from the depths of Scripture and using these eloquent prayers to show off in front of other people, which had to make their prayers seem awfully shallow and awfully self-serving. And that brings us back to our passage about fasting. There's a really interesting turn of phrase that Jesus uses here, because he's talking about people that as they're fasting, giving up food or water or whatever it is, as they're fasting, they're intentionally making themselves unrecognizable. They're making themselves look sick or weary or tired or exhausted. They're doing things to their physical appearance so that people can't even quite recognize who they are anymore. They were apparently going out of their way to look sick and tired and exhausted, kind of like all of our youth ministry volunteers after an all-night lock-in. Except they were doing this to draw attention to themselves. And so the word here is actually an opposite word of what they're looking for. So they make their faces unrecognizable on purpose so that they can be recognized for their religious superiority. They make themselves physically unrecognizable so that other people recognize how awesome and righteous and religious they are. So in each of these instances, Jesus' concern is that people are using their worship as a way of enhancing their own status, their own kingdom, their own popularity, their own power, instead of putting the honor and the glory where it's due, which is on God. So when we take these three ideas together, and I think you really do have to take all of them together to understand what Jesus is getting at, Jesus is talking about three things that we might need to give up if we really want to trust Jesus fully. So when Jesus talks about giving, he's asking us to let go of our financial resources and to stop using our financial resources as a way of gaining or seeking power in our life. When he talks about prayer, I think he's asking us to give up control of our lives and to give that control over to God and to trust him with it. And when he talks about fasting, he's asking us to let go of even the physical necessities that we need to survive on a daily basis. Each one of these acts of worship has at its core the idea of putting God first instead of ourselves, or putting others first instead of our own concerns. Each one of these acts of worship is a declaration that because God is enough for me, I can give away my financial resources. Because God is sufficient, I can trust him and let him take control of my life. Because God is all I need, I can fast even from the daily necessities of food and water and Wi-Fi and everything else that we feel like we need. So fasting is just one of many ways that Jesus wants us to let go of the things that we cling to for comfort and security, to let go of them so that we can return God to his rightful place as the highest priority and the primary focus of our lives. It's a way of letting go of the things that we cling to, the things that we think are going to make us happy and successful and give us purpose and meaning, to let go of those so that we can remind ourselves that God deserves to be number one and that God is sufficient and he's all that we need. Well, Jesus doesn't just talk the talk about fasting. He also walks the walk. And he gives us a great example of the way or the role that fasting plays in the life of a believer. So we're in Matthew chapter 6. The Sermon on the Mount starts in Matthew chapter 5. And right before that in Matthew chapter 4, Jesus gives us this example of fasting. And it says, then Jesus, in Matthew chapter 4, verse 1, then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted there by the devil. For 40 days and 40 nights he fasted and became very hungry. Obviously, a huge understatement, one of the biggest understatements of the Bible, perhaps. After fasting for 40 days, he became quite hungry. Jesus fasted for 40 days. And I think one of the reasons that he did that was to remind himself that God was enough. Why do you think that idea, that mindset, would have been particularly important at that moment of Jesus' life? It's because the devil was about to show up and start tempting him with all kinds of things of this world that would distract Jesus from following God. Each of those temptations that he faced, the temptation to prove himself, the temptation to have power over the world, the temptation with glory and honor and all of these things. Each one of those temptations was based on the lie that Jesus' happiness is the most important thing. Each one of those temptations was predicated on the lie that the most important thing is how Jesus feels in the moment. They were based on the lie that if it felt good, it must be okay. It was based on the lie that God wanted Jesus to be happy in every circumstance. So of course it's okay to compromise a little bit or look the other way. But Jesus could see past the devil's lies. Jesus had spent his 40 days fasting, kind of getting that right mindset that God is enough and that God is the number one priority for him. By fasting for that long, Jesus was able to remind himself that there was a spiritual reality that was more important than the physical needs that he felt in that moment. And because of that mindset, he was able to fight back against those temptations and fight back with the truth of God's word. All right, so what is fasting? We've kind of talked all the way around it, but here's kind of my take on it. After we've said all of that and studied and seen what Jesus has taught and the example that he's given us, I think fasting is intentionally saying no to your wants or needs to create a heightened awareness of the sufficiency of God and his promises in your life. That's kind of long-winded, right? So I think fasting is intentionally giving things up so that we can focus more on God and remind ourselves that Jesus is enough, that God is enough for us. There's a lot of different things that people might fast from. Some of the most common things are food, and whether that's just completely not eating anything at all, or maybe eating only very, very simple meals like bread and water. Maybe coffee or caffeine. Maybe you're going to cut out sugar, eating out. Maybe you want to fast from your car and take a bike or walk to work or to school. Maybe you want to fast from TV or Netflix or phone or social media or kind of everything else that goes along with that. Is there anything on that list that you think you probably need to take a little break from? Is there anything on that list that, if we're honest, is probably a little too important in your life right now? Is there anything on there, or maybe something that you would add, that has become so important and so crucial to your happiness that it's actually leading you farther away from God instead of towards him? Each one of these things is neutral on its own. And each one of them can be a tremendous blessing in our life. But like the mustard and the deviled eggs or the hamburger patties, when these things get out of control, they stop being a blessing. And they start being a curse. You know, there's a scene from a really tremendously awesome TV show called Friends, and I don't know if everyone in this room watches Friends. I can't totally endorse everything that happens in the course of the show, but there's a really incredible scene in this show where Joey and Chandler, two best friends, are completely arguing, and they have this huge fight over the idea of borrowing each other's clothes. And Joey is so mad at Chandler that he can't figure out what to do to get back at this guy. So he finally realizes, I'm going to go to his apartment and put on every single piece of clothing that this guy owns. And then he shows back up on the scene and he's like, could I be wearing any more clothes? And so he's just totally making fun of his friend here. And I think we do this with the way that we just add one thing after another, after another, after another to our already busy, over-scheduled, over-luxurious lives. This is us. We're constantly looking for one more thing that we can add to our lives that's going to make us feel happy or successful or important or worthwhile. We're looking for that next meal, that next relationship, that next phone, that next car, that next vacation, that next experience that's going to help us overcome the feelings of maybe emptiness or regret or shame or loneliness. We're looking for something to add to our already overscheduled and busy lives, and we end up looking like this. And I think when God looks down at us, sometimes he says, look, you're wearing every single thing that this world has to offer. When are you going to realize that God is enough? You know, when I was in high school, my freshman year of high school, I kind of had this mentality that if I wanted to get into the best colleges and really make a name for myself and really have this successful life, I needed to do as many extracurricular activities as I could. I just really needed to be like crazy with the things that I was adding to my schedule, all right? So I played trombone in high school, and so I got to school an hour early to be in the jazz band. I was taking honors classes as a freshman in high school, which had an extra workload, a lot of extra homework. Right after school got out, I stayed an extra hour late to do concert band, which is somehow different than jazz band in the morning. And on top of that, I was also in the marching band. And I thought it'd be a really good idea to not only be in the marching band, but to also sign up for the freshman football team. So for one day, I was on the freshman football team, and I sat in the bleachers with my helmet, and I'm sitting there. It's 5 o'clock at night. I'm on the football team. I'm doing marching band. I'm doing concert band. I'm doing jazz band, and I'm doing honors classes. And I'm thinking to myself, I am not going to make it out of my freshman year. I'm going to die of exhaustion. I was like Joey. I was trying to wear every single thing that this world has to offer. And sometimes we do that, and we're not willing to let it go because we feel like we need all of it. We've bought into the lie that we need these things, we need this stuff, we need these experiences in order to feel full and meaningful and happy. And Jesus is saying, are you willing to let some of it go, to remind yourselves that God is enough, that Jesus is enough, that the Holy Spirit is enough? We need to learn to say no. We need to say, not right now. We need to give each other permission to say no as well. We need to learn to let go of the things that we think we need so that God can return to his rightful place as the number one priority and the primary focus in our lives. And so that's going to bring us to our faith challenges for today. And the first one is just to reflect on what captures your attention and desires the most. As you think about the way you spend your daily life on a day-to-day basis, your schedule, what do you turn to when you're feeling really down? What brings you comfort? What brings you joy? What are the things that really draw and capture your desires and attention the most? So just reflect on that. We kind of have to know what we're dealing with. What are the things in our life that are sort of the highest priority, our primary focus? The second one is just to start small with a short fast. You have to start small. You can't just say, I'm going to do the Jesus challenge and go 40 days without eating anything. All right, that's like saying, tomorrow I want to run a marathon. All right, I've done zero training up to this point in my life. The longest I've ever run in one sort of session is like barely 2 miles. So I'm not going to wake up tomorrow and say, let me run a marathon. If you really want to work up to something like that, we have to start small. And my guess, is that for a lot of people, fasting is one of the things that we've heard about, that maybe we've talked about, but it's not something that is part of our daily lives the way that Jesus was talking about. And I will be the first to admit that fasting is usually not part of my worship experience. It's not part of my daily rhythms. It's not something that I do regularly. So right now, I am preaching to myself and saying this is something that I, as a full-time minister, need to do as well. And I need this in my life because I can see how a lot of those things on the list that I put up are becoming more important than they should be and they need to be. So at the risk of kind of flying in the face of what Jesus is saying about don't broadcast it publicly, I just want to let you know I would really like to start trying some of this. And I hope that you would like to do that as well. But start small. And the last one is just to give yourself, your spouse, your family, your friends permission to say no. Because I think part of the problem is that we feel like we have to say yes to everything. If there's an opportunity to do something, let's go do it because we don't want to miss out. We overschedule our lives. We fill everything up to the max, and we need to learn to say no to certain things to create more space and awareness of God's presence in our life. Fasting is not a punishment that Jesus is doling out on people to make us feel miserable so we'll reflect on how much we're blessed. Fasting is a gift that Jesus gives us to help us reorient our perspective and to remind ourselves that in a world full of empty promises, in a world full of every kind of product that you can think of, the gift is realizing that Jesus is enough. That as we follow Jesus, we learn that we can say no to anything and everything else that this world has to offer because following Jesus is enough. We're going to offer an invitation as we sing this next song. And the invitation is to take one more step closer to Jesus in your walk with him. There's some really cool opportunities that we have to be part of groups, community groups. Andrew spoke about Alpha, which is a great way to just learn the basics of the Christian faith and talk about it in an informal, open environment. You can talk about, you can bring your own perspective, your own thoughts, and share it there, and it's a safe place just to explore the Christian faith. That would be an awesome opportunity for you to come with the person that you are loving to Jesus. And then there's also the Project Martha and Mary women's groups that are going to be starting very, very soon. And if you're looking for a group of women that's going to love you, encourage you, spur you on towards fasting and prayer and giving and all the things that we've been talking about, you'll have the opportunity to sign up for those. Those are coming up really, really soon. There's so many ways that you can use this church family right here to grow in your relationship with God, to grow in your knowledge of God and follow Jesus. And our prayer right now is that if you need anything, prayers for support, prayers for your marriage, prayers for health, that you would come and let our shepherds know as we stand and sing this next song.